So we're going to turn now to the Mishnah on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, which you'll see right there in the middle of the Amud. And the Mishnah establishes what's called Nidrei Onsin. And what is Nidrei Onsin? Hidiro Chavero Shiyochal Etzlo. So we have a Madir and a Mudar, or you can call it a Mazmin and a Muzman. And the Madir, the Mazmin, says to the Muzman that if you don't come to eat with me and be my guest in my home, then all my nechasim will be osir on you. So he's Madir, his friend B'Tnai. And the Tnai is that if he doesn't show up and he refuses and he's obstinate and he refuses to eat in his house, then the neder should be chal. But what happened at the end? There were good intentions on the part of the muzman, of the mudar, but chola. Chola hu, o chola bino, o she'ikfo nohar, hare elu nidrei onsin. So the kiyum atnai, which would activate the neder, which would be that the mudar, we'll call him Shimon, did not show up, that kiyum atnai was ba'ones. There were circumstances beyond his control that prevented him from showing up, even though he very much wanted to be a guest in the home of the Madir. And the Mishnah establishes Hare Elu Nidrei Onsim, and the neder is not chal, and therefore the mudar is allowed to have hanoah from the nechasim of the Madir. And the Mishnah gives three different cases. The Nemuki Yosef says that we should apply the principle of lo zu afzu, going from the lesser chiddush, which is a greater onus, to the lower chiddush, the lesser chiddush, which is less of an onus. Right? The greater the onus, then the more simple it becomes to say that this is not called a kiyum atnai because it was ba'onus. So the most extreme, severe case of onus is cholahu. That means his guf. He's laid up in bed or in a hospital and he can't come. No, that's also an onus haguf, but nevertheless, it's not his guf, it's the guf of his son. And even in the case of ikfo nohar, which is a financial consideration, as the Rishonim say that he could pay for a cruise ship, to take him across the river and get there to be a guest in his Madir's home. So even that's considered an onus. So the Gemara says, we have a problem here with a statement of Rav Huna. What was the case that Rav Huna ruled in? Hahu gavra di atvis sachvasa bebeidina. He brings his shtaros, let's say he's a malve, and he has a claim against the love, and he takes his shtar and puts it on the table of the Bezdin and says to the Bezdin, look, I can't deal with this now. I still have, edim and other evidence that I want to adduce and produce, but right now I need to stay and hold on to my schuyos for a period of 30 days. Ilo I see not plus in Yom, if I don't show up within the next 30 days, li batlin hanis chuse, I'm botel. No, it's my schuyos are completely null and void. So that now, if he doesn't show up in 30 days, then hodas baldin kemea edim dami, and he has basically invalidated all his rayos and all his shtaros and other proofs. He has no longer a claim against the so-called love. But what happens? Itness. He really wanted to come and show up and then re-establish his rights to his chuyos, to his shtaros and all his other proofs and evidence, but he was prevented from showing up with circumstances beyond his control. He got sick, his son got sick, etc. And he didn't show up. And in that particular scenario, Amar Rav Huna gave the ruling that Batil Zachvase. He did not show up. Therefore, the condition that he formulated was fulfilled. He did not show up. And he loses his chuyos. even though he was prevented from breaking up this Tanai and this Mechila on his part by onus, by circumstances beyond his control. Amalei Rava, and the Rishonim have a different Girsia, Amalei Rabba. Rabba says to Rav Huna, Anusu, you can't say that he didn't show up. What do you mean he didn't show up? He really wanted to show up. He couldn't show up. He was anus. And if he was prevented from showing up to be mavatal the Tanai because of onus, then that's not considered as if he was Mekayim the Tanai. How do I know this? Rabbah quotes a pasuk in Chumash, in Parshas Kitetze. Onus Rachmana Patre, Dichsiv, in the case of a Nara Hamurasa, and unfortunately she was raped, is V'lanara lo sasa davar. The Torah is saying that we cannot punish her because this action was done to her against her will. She was coerced. And the case is that she couldn't yell out and scream because it happened out there in the fields. There was no one there to hear her. And the Torah considers her guiltless because of onus. So you see, says Rabbah, that the Torah considers onus as something that is not to be blamed. You're not blamed for onus. So this person who made this Tanai, that if I don't show up, my schuyos should be batel, why should he lose his schuyos? Why are you punishing him by removing all his schuyos when he had every intention to show up and therefore to cancel his mechila? So Rabbah himself, even after having raised the objection to Rav Huna and quoting the pasuk L'nau lo sasa davar, he says v'chitema k'tol shiny. I understand that you are going to tell me that this is not a good proof, because when the Torah says that a person, in this case a married woman who has an extramarital relationship, should be put to death, but here the Torah is saying we can't put her to death. We're going to exonerate her from punishment, from the capital punishment, because she was anus. She was in a situation of duress, it was compelled against her will. So therefore, at this point, it seems that Rabbah drops his argument based on the pasuk L'nau lo sasa davar. Again, L'nau lo sasa davar is a halach in P'tur Onsin. But that doesn't mean that if a person had a Tanai and he fulfilled his Tanai, at least in a literal sense, just that he was onus because he wanted to be mavatal the Tanai, prove from that the Tanai is not considered Makuyim, when again, literally and physically he was Makayim the Tanai. I can't prove that, admittedly, from V'lanara l'sasa davar, which is halacha that alleviates her from punishment. But I do have a proof against you, Rav Huna, Vatnan, from the Mishnah that we just learned now, Nidrei Onsin. In a case where the Kiyum Tanai was done ba'ones, Hidir chaver she'ochaletz v'cholu ochol b'no, oshik v'nar, is Harei Elu Nidrei Onsin. The neder is batul mevutal, it's not valid. What happened over here? He was madhir if you don't show up, and he didn't show up. So the Kiyum Tanai was literally fulfilled, but the answer is the neder is batil, and the Kiyum Tanai is not valid. Why? Because it was ba'ones. So we see that even above and beyond the halach of onshim here, we're not dealing with the issue of onshim. We're dealing with whether the neder is chal or not chal. The answer is that Kiyum Tanai, to generate and activate the neder, is not considered Kiyum Tanai if it was a result of ones. So why then, in a person who made a Tanai that I will be mafsid and mavatal all my schuyos if I don't show up, when he really wanted to show up, but he couldn't, he was prevented from doing so because of ones, that's not called a kiyum Tanai. If it's not a kiyum Tanai in Nedarim to activate the neder, and the Mishnah says the neder is not valid, then it should be considered as if it's not a kiyum Tanai as far as the person who says imlo basi ad tlosim yomin. If he was prevented from coming, that's not called a kiyum Tanai.
But he wasn't meaning just because he waited to the, meaning was he prevented the whole time period?
Well, that's a sugya later on. You'll see in the essay that we're going to analyze today. I think you have the whole essay. Am I right? So again, we're not going to get into this because unless you want to continue on this next week, but on page Nun Vav, which is towards the end of... You don't have that far? All right. Okay, Nun Vav, just for your own edification, and you could always take a picture of my Gemara if you don't have the Masifta, is called Ones Liom Achron. And that's going to be a machlokas rishonim in a person who had a 30-day stay, and he figured he'll come on the last day. And he was honest on the last day. Is that enough to make him into an ones?
Is that not a full like shasugya?
This is a ksubis sugya. This is called the famous shitas aguda, and nothing to do with politics. But
we have with davening. Someone does davening the last minute. He's honest.
Right.
Is
Excellent.
Is it not exactly the same sugya in the beginning ksubis? It's not the sugya of
so let's hold on for just 2 minutes to get to your comment. But first, let's just summarize what we have over here. We have a machlokas between Rav Huna and Rabbah. And Rabbah raises an objection to Rav Huna by comparing the case of Bittul Zchuyos, which is a Dini Mominos case, to our Mishnah of Nidrei Onsin. We don't find in the Gemara any defense in which Rabbah deflects the kasha, in which Rav Huna deflects the kasha of Rabbah, meaning, obviously, we have no choice but to assume that Rav Huna is going to make a distinction between our Mishnah of Nidrei Onsim and the case of Ones in Bittul Zchuyos in Dini Mominos. But the Gemara doesn't even give us an insight, even a clue as to what Rav Huna would have argued in his own self-defense against Rabbah. Instead, what the Gemara is going to do now, and we'll see the Gemara inside, is the Gemara is going to tell us that Rabbah himself has a limit, and he himself will admit and concede that in two different categories of cases, the halacha is that despite the ones, it's still considered a kiyum tanai. Ula Rabbah, again, if you have the girsa, Maishna mehadis nan. We have a Mishnah in Gittin. A man gives a get to his wife and he declares, he gives himself a 12-month period of time to come and be mevatel the get. He died within that 12 months. And the Mishnah establishes that the get is chal. So wait a second, according to you, Rabbah, there's no greater onus than Misa, and yet it's considered as if lo basi, that the fulfillment of the Tanai to validate the get is considered as if it was fulfilled, even those fulfilled by onus. And the Gemara answers that this is a case where Rabbah would agree, and this you'll see here on page Chav Zayin Amud Beis, the Iyaviyadis the mis is min lialta avi gomer v'yav gita, and this is the principle called shel tizakek ishto liibum. A man very often is motivated to deliver a get to his wife because he has a brother. They don't have any children. He has a brother out in Kalamazoo, and he's locked up in a jail, and he's whatever. And therefore, a husband, out of the goodness of his heart, wants to create a situation where his wife will be a grusha rather than be an almana, because if she'll be an almana, she'll be a yavam l'shu. So if we analyze the reason why, the motivation for him giving the get, we understand very well that Adarab, because he died, he wants to give it the get. Because as a result of his death, she'll fall for Yibum. He wants to circumvent that and not throw her into that brach where she can't marry anyone. She's stuck for life. She's an aguna because we can't get a hold of the choletz. And that's exactly why he gave a get. So even though the kiyum atnai of lo basi was ba'ones, because he couldn't have possibly come from the grave, nevertheless, Rabbah would agree in this case that is considered a kiyum atnai, but not because of the general halachas of kiyum atnai, but because of the understanding of what motivated him to give the get.
From the example that he would not want his wife to be tukaf for Yibum, we learned about a situation in which that get could be chal. But what happens then when we look at like 99 out of 100 married couples would never be shaykh to Yibum, either because they already have a child or so in a case where there would not be like
right. If this motivation didn't exist and there was no possibility of Yibum, and we're not going to say, well, he's giving her a get because he is afraid that she'll fall for Yibum. If there's no fear on his part, then obviously we're going to apply the principle of Rabbah that bittul, that kiyum atnai ba'onis is not considered kiyum atnai. So the imlo basi, which was the condition that was set by the Megaresh for the validity of the get, was never fulfilled. Why? Because that was onus.
So
It's only in this situation where we have all the facts on the table. We know that there's no children, that there's a brother out there and wherever, and therefore he's giving her a get kadesh lo tipo b'fnei yov.
But if an actual Beis Din saw this get and they saw that and they learned that the husband died, would they say, okay, question one is, would she have been omedet liyibum?
The question would be, why didn't he come? And if she was omedet liyibum, we'll say that he didn't come because of onus, but he wanted the get. If on the other hand he wasn't motivated by yibum, then we'll say if he didn't come because of onus, he doesn't want the get, and therefore the get would not be chal. That's not called the kiyum tonight. Again, all this is according to whom? According to Rabbah. Now we have to figure out what Rav Huna is going to do with all this, and that's going to be the bulk of what we want to discuss. But again, I just wanted to point out to you in terms of the structure of the sugya, it's so fascinating that the Gemara doesn't even pick up Rav Huna at all and ask, well, how does Rav Huna square with the fact that there's a concept called ones, and that the Mishnah says in Nidrei Onsin that a kiyum tanai b'ones is not considered a kiyum tanai, and therefore the neder was chal if he wouldn't come, and he really wanted to come. The Gemara doesn't even address that. The Gemara is now giving us the exceptions to the rule and the categories in which even Rabbah would agree that despite the fact that the kiyum tanai was b'ones, nevertheless, it validates the chalos. And now we get to the second exception, and that's the case umayshna hahudi omalu ilo asina mikan vatalsin yomi levi gita. If I don't show up in the next 30 days, the get should be chal. Also, he comes at the end of the 30 days. Again, Ellie's question about onus b'yom achron, and paske mabra. Rashi gives two interpretations. Either paske mabra means that the river separated him from the shore, and there were no possibilities of crossing the river. Or paske mabra means there was a bridge that connected him on that side of the shore with his wife and his home on the other side of the shore, but the bridge fell down. London bridges falling down. Amalahu, the man is standing on the other side of the river, and he's yelling and screaming. A very dramatic case. Chazudasai, chazudasai. Look, I'm here. But you're not here. You're on the other side of the river. Amar Shmuel loshmei masya. You didn't come. It's a kiyum tanai. The tanai wasn't lo basi. Well, in fact, lo basi. The get is therefore valid. Tough luck. Go find yourself another wife. According to Rabbah, that we have a principle of kiyum tanai, but onus is not valid, then therefore chazudasai. He's obviously being prevented because of onus. Paske mavre. And the Gemara says this is another exception to the rule where Rabbah would agree that kiyum tanai bonus is considered a valid kiyum tanai. Dilma onsa de megalia shiny. Everybody should realize that if situations will arise in which you can't cross the river because the bridge is shaky, reminds me of Efrat and Hafsakat Chashmal. If a person, he thinks, going into Shabbos that he's going to have Chashmal for Shabbos and it's raining outside, forget it. So here, we're going to say that Paske Mabra is Megale Onsa. It's a Dover Matsui V'Golui. He should have taken that into consideration. He should have made the following stipulation. If I don't come because I decide I don't want to come, then the get will be valid. But if I don't come because of Paske Mavre, which is Shchiach and Matsui, then the get should not be valid. The very fact that he didn't make that stipulation, realizing full well that every muntik and dardishtik, the bridge breaks down, then he has to suffer the loss.
So we didn't put that condition on the previous case. We didn't say, if you really want the get and you don't come and you die in the middle, so you should have put that condition also. Or if I should die and don't come, and that's the reason why I don't come.
So now you get to the question whether death is something shchiach or not shchiach. So that's what we want to see inside.
It happens once in a lifetime.
That's true.
But you could always get, you could
Can't die
always,
twice, right?
no, but you got to.
Well, I have a few jokes about that, but not for now. All right, Rabosai.
So that's one. That's one. Whether it's good for two, we go into his das. We say, we look in and say, because of Yibum and all that, and he really wanted to get. If we know he's screaming on the other side, there's no better Gilui Das than to say he really wants to come back. So
and he doesn't want to get to be Chal.
So why are we ignoring his Das in that case, but we don't ignore
Because again,
what?
It's a question of Shchiach or lo Shchiach. Right now, the Gemara is assuming that death is not Shchiach.
I'm saying forget the Shchiach lo Shchiach. Talk about the focus on his Das. We focus it on his unspoken das in the case of Yibum, right? We say, obviously, he wants to avoid his, a Yibum situation. So even in his death, forget Shchiach or no Shchiach. He didn't come, and it's Chal. Here, he didn't come.
It might be different because in the case of Yibum, that essentially is the whole reason that he gave the get off tonight. The whole mahut of the get off tonight was because he wanted to free his wife from a case of being a potential Yivam Alashuk. While over here, it may be shachiach or lo shachiach, but it was not the prime reason that he put the whole tonight there.
Also, his kavanah now is irrelevant. We need to know what his kavanah was when he made the
That's what I was going to say.
He's screaming, it's irrelevant.
Okay, so what was
right.
his kavanah?
So the fact that he should have been aware and anticipated this onus to shchiach, and he didn't make a stipulation that that's not considered a kiyum atrai, that the get should not be chal, an event that, today is Monday, Thursday, and the bridge went down.
So, but then we should use that in any case of onus.
And that's exactly what the Gemara is saying. That Rabbah's principle is only an unforeseen onus. That's when Rabbah says that an onus is not considered kiyum tanai. But if it's foreseeable and a likely onus, whatever shchiach means, I'm not breaking it down into statistical probabilities, then we're going to always ask the question, why didn't you stipulate this? And the fact that you left it out indicates that on all circumstances, you want to get to bichal.
This is equivalent to, you American law, contract law. Either you have a force majeure contract stipulation in the contract.
Are you a lawyer first?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. No, I'm dealing with,
So either you have
Adam's also a lawyer, so
you have
he understands what you're talking about.
Either you have a force majeure provision or you don't. It's not a question of whether that is common or not. Acts of God can happen at any moment in time.
So your mouth is the mouth of Rav Huna. We're in Rabbah now. Rav Huna is going to argue exactly what you say. Let's look at the contract. You didn't stipulate any exceptions to the rule. The contract was fulfilled to the T. Imlo Basi, and you didn't show up. Is therefore it's chal. But Rabbah's coming with a kind of halachic approach, and we're going to have to see what it's based on. Is it svara? Is it kra? Does he have a pasuk or whatever? And he's coming up with a principle that the Torah does not consider onus as if he was Makayim the Tanakh. And that goes beyond the contract itself as it was formulated. All right. So let's take a look now in the Otzer Hayunim. We're looking at Marocha Lamed Aleph, and we're on page Mem Vav. Okay. So in the paragraph number 3 on the right side, Big Gemara, he summarizes the shakla v'tarya between Rabbah and Rav Huna. And on the 4th line, he writes that das Rav Huna sha'af shalo ba machmas ones, that's considered a kiyum atnai v'hifsid zchuyosov. And Rabbah says, wait a minute, the Torah says la nara lo sasadova. The Torah doesn't consider an action that's done ba'onis as an action. And even if you'll argue maybe that's only a p'tur from Misas Bezdin, then what are you going to do with our Mishnah? By analogy, in our Mishnah, we see that if the kiyum atnai of Lobasi on behalf of the Muda was be honest because of one of the 3 onsim that we discussed, that's not considered kiyum atnai, and the neder is not chal. And it's very interesting that, as I said before, the Gemara now, after having heard the analogy of Rabbah, doesn't even bother to defend Rav Huna and set up a distinction between our mission of Onsim and Nedarim and the case of Dini Momenos when he was mafsid his chuyos. But instead, what we do have, and this is what I think Daniel was referring to before, a Gemara in Ksubas Daf Beis Amid Beis. And the Gemara there seems to assume that if a man says imlo basi, that the get should be chal, and he was nenas, then the get on a doraisa level is not chal. The Rabbanah made a takana based on called the Makadesh, Adaita the Rabbanah Makadesh and Afkinu Rabbanon, that the get should be chal. This is just put it in your back pocket for if we learn Ksufis, that there is a possibility that the Rabbanon could create a get where a get doesn't exist. And that's exactly what happens here, because the reason why lo basi was because he was anus. And the Gemara says the get is not chal. Why isn't the get chal? Because that kiyum atanai of lo basi was not a willing kiyum atanai. It was coerced upon him. And the only reason the Rabbana made this takana that the get should be chal is mishum tznuos umishum prutzos. Which again, if we have time, we could discuss that, but I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent. Now we're going to have here in this os beis, which you'll see on the bottom of the right column going on to the left column, a machlokes between the Ran and the Rosh as to what principle, what logic underlies our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that Nidrei Onsin are not chal because he was Mekayim the lo basi, meaning the mudar did not come because of circumstances beyond his control onus. So the Ran has one approach and the Rosh a totally different approach. The Ran uses the logic of umdana. And he says the following. Let's analyze the mindset of the Madir when he took this neder. If he would have known that the mudar could not show up because of those onsim, would he have nevertheless insisted on being madir the person? He was only using the neder as a tool to get this person to show up. And if the person really wanted to show up, would the madir really want the neder? So that even though we have a principle called dvarim shebalev lo avi dvarim, but the exception to that is umdana demuchach, when we see by analyzing the circumstances that there's evidence to assume that under these circumstances he would not want the chalos, he would not want the ned. So let me just stop for 1 second and ask you the following question. It's almost a rhetorical question, but it's almost a simple question, but I just want to make sure we're all on board. According to the Ran's understanding as to why this neder is not chal, are we dealing with a halacha that is universal in kol Torah kula? In other words, whenever the Torah requires das, says the Ran, we're going to ask for an umdana and try to shatz up and evaluate his das, or is the Ran operating within the strict boundaries of Nedarim? Is it a universal halacha of kol Torah kula, or is it a din, as Reb Chaim would have said, a din misuyam, a specific din in Nedarim? What would you say?
Seems like a more broad issue.
Correct. It's a din in kol Torah kula. We're analyzing a person's das, and we're talking about umdana. And for example, the Gemara is going to say in Masechet Kedushin, he sold his property because he wanted to go on Aliyah, and there was an umdana demuchach. At the end, he couldn't go on Aliyah, blah, blah, blah. So we see that there's a concept here that's universal in halacha called umdana demuchach, and nowhere does the Ran quote any pasuk. If there was a pasuk in the Pasha Nedarim, then we might operate with the opposite conclusion, that maybe the Mishnah is invalidating the neder because of a unique halacha that's restricted to Nedarim. Now we move on to the Rosh. The Rosh you'll see on the left column. Again, I'm not going to go through everything because it would take us a month. But the Rosh says the following, that Tamo shel Rav Huna, Shalo huk shalomi mishnasenu. Now, watch what goes on here. The Ran was focused on Rabbah. And Rabbah understood that our Mishnah could be a keresh kvitzah to learn kol Torah kula and would have an impact on the case of matfis chuyosa because he's operating with the universal halacha of umdana demucha. Says the Rosh, let's go back to Rav Huna. And Rav Huna is postulating a distinction between Nedarim and Dinim Aminos. Says the Rosh, Taima shel Rav Huna, Shedina Mishnu rak b'dinei Nedarim. So again, when we're talking about invalidating the neder, is it a din mesuyam in Nedarim, or is it universal halacha? Says Rav Huna, the way Rosh understands it, it's a din mesuyam. Why? Now we have to underline these next few words. Debe'inon shiyu piv v'libo shavin. And we're going to see in just one moment that halach, that principle in Nedarim of piv v'libo shavim, is derived from a pasuk. So hold on for a minute. That's going to be where the Ritva adds something to this rush. Masechet in Mammon, in the case of Mammon, there's no halach of piv v'libo shavin. I enter into a transaction, and like you said before, I sign a contract. Let's read the contract. And therefore, with all due respect, whatever you had in your heart, that's not something that we can deal with. We go to a lawyer, the lawyer says, look at the contract. You did fulfill the contract of lo basi. Then we keep to the literal translation of the contract, which obligates it. And now we have the Ritva in the next paragraph that starts Yeshe Kosvu, and the Ritva is going to give us a deeper insight into what the Rosh is saying. The Rosh is operating with a unique principle of Piv V'libo Shavin, unique to Nedarim, says the Ritva, Tama Heta, the reason why this neder is not Chal, Mishum Ha'adam B'Shvua, Prat La'onis. He quotes a drasha, this is a sugya in Masechet Shvuas Adaf Chavav, about a case of a person who thought that he ate and he took a shvuah that I didn't eat, and he forgot that he had eaten, and the Gemara says he's not chayav for shvuah because of other v'shvuah. And therefore, you see that the Ritva is operating within a framework of a din mesuyam that's derived from a drasha yalfusa with regard to Nedarim, shvuas and Nedarim. And therefore, the Rosh is absolutely correct when he says that we have a new halacha principle that underlies Nedarim called Piv V'libo Shavin. Don't jump to any conclusions beyond the confines of Nedarim. But again, if you go with the Ritva and the Rosh, if we make that combination, then who's going to now become very difficult? Rabbah. Rabbah was assuming an analogy between the two. And it says here, in the next paragraph, Haritva, Vanamuki Yosef Kosfu, Shetayim Dekra. Underline those two words, time of the Kra. Whenever I see those two words, I get very nervous. Time of the Kra, because that means you're going into a speculation and trying to understand the logic behind the pasuk. But that's exactly what the Ritva is going to do here, and I understand what motivates him, because he wants to go beyond Nedarim. He wants to justify Rabbah's analogy between Nedarim and Dinim Amenos. You're going to have to add a time of the Kra. If you add a time of the Kra, that the pasuk is just a Gili Milsa to teach me something that I can apply elsewhere, then I can justify Rabbah and his analogy. So what's the time of the Kra? Let's analyze his mindset. And basically what you end up with is umdana. And if you're using circumstantial evidence by asking what would he have wanted, then we should apply that to the case of a person who's matfis chuyos of a bezdin. Let's admit it, guys. When I'm matfis chuyos of a bezdin, if you would have asked me, well, if I knew that chashoah, my son would get sick at the end of the 30-day period, would I agree to be mavato my chuyos? Of course not. So therefore, we're left with an equation between Nedarim and Dinim Amenos and matfis chuso. The only thorn in the back, that's bothering us here is that in Nedarim, according to the Ritva, we're learning that this halach is derived from Ha'adam B'Shvuah, which is a pasuk in Chumash. But the answer to that is time of the Kra. Do you see that? Time of the Kra, which is as we would say in modern Hebrew, noaz. This is really a chutzpah to say, oh, I know time of the Kra. But it comes out now, according to the Ritva, that this universal halach of umdana that allows me to disqualify what we call dvarim shebelev enum dvarim is derived from the Pasha Nedarim. Where is the source for umdana? Says the Ritva, it's right here in Nedarim, ha'adam b'shvuah. The problem is that Rabbi Kivega has a Rivash. The Rivash lived about 5 centuries ago. And the Rivash, at least in his first presentation, he has 2 presentations, he says that En tama heta mishum shelo hoya kach belibo. Forget about umdana. Leave out umdana. But what's the time of the heter? Mishum kra de ha'adam b'shvua. So somehow the Rivash understands that put aside all your time in the cross, put aside all your analysis of the man's mindset and motivation and his das and umdana de muchach, leave that all out. Just operate within the context of ha'adam b'shvua. And there's going to be a whole page here called Page Mem Zion, which we're not going to study today, in which there's going to be an analysis of what ha'adam b'shvua means, when does it apply, why does it apply, but the bottom line is that it's a special halacha in Hilchas Nedarim. And there the Torah raises the ante as far as what qualifies as a neder and teaches us ha'adam b'shvua, prat la'anus. But if that prat la'anus is a din misuyam in Nedarim that's derived from this Gzeres HaKosav and this Yalfus of Adam B'Shvua, then clearly we're in a brach as far as Rabbah is concerned. What was his analogy to Matvis Zechuyosa? And that's what in the next paragraph he quotes from Kiveger, Hiksha, L'tamer Ivasha, Hete Nidrei Onsin Machmas Kra, De Adam B'Shvua, Ma Porich Rabel Rav Huna. What was Rabbah's kash against Rav Huna? Hare Medubar Le'inyan Dini Mominus. Rav Huna is talking about Dini Mominus. And our Mishnah is talking about a special chiddush, a unique halach in Hilchos Nedarim derived from the Alfusa of Adam B'Shvua. So that's the kasha that we have on the Rivash.
Well, that's enough focus somewhere, right?
Could be. Maybe according to the Rivash, that's good for what it is. Can we be Dorish time in the Kra or can we not? But Rav Kivega understood that the Rivash is learning our Mishnah. That's how he touches up our Mishnah. That in our Mishnah, we're talking in the context of a special halacha of Ha'adam B'Shvua. V'achena Ritva B'Sugyan Hikshal Atzmo, right? Because you remember that it was the Ritva who supported the Rosh by saying that we're dealing with Gzeres HaKosav, a Yalfus of Adam B'Shvua. And therefore, he's going to ask the same kasha as Rabbi Kivega just about 5 centuries earlier, and that is, how could I possibly justify Rabbah's analogy from Nedarim to Hatfosas Zechuyos in Dini Mominos when Nedarim is a special halacha, which the Ritva says is derived from Adam B'Shvua? And the answer is time of the Kra. V'yishe b'zeh shezeh atzmo tam. Again, underlining the word tam, ha-posuk. Again, whenever I see tam ha-posuk, that's very speculative. We don't want to give, let's say, too much of a credit to our speculation of what the tam of the posuk is. But the Ritva is going to operate here, and he has no choice, given the fact that A, he derives the halacha in the Nedarim from a posuk, and B, Rabbah jumped to conclusions about Matvis Kusa. We have to derive time of the Kra. Mishum Shlohoya B'daito. Let's analyze what his das was. Shlohoya B'daito lesar im yellow onis b'shas kiyumat. And that's what he emphasizes here later on. Kevan sheish umdana shadaiti dehachi lo niskavin shiachu. Now, obviously, if the Ritva is learning time of the Kra and he's introducing the principle of umdana b'daito, and therefore it makes it into universal halacha, then we switch everything back, and now we have to ask what Rav Huna's understanding is. Did Rav Huna not see the das of the Matvis Zechuyosov, and why does he break up this analogy from Nedarim? So what I'd like to do now is fast forward to page Memches. Only because, we try to do one sugya a week, so we're limited in time. So you'll see here on the bottom of the right column on Memches, Hachiluk bein tos b'nedarim l'tos b'kinyon. And basically this entire section, number Daled, is an attempt to defend Rav Huna. Because as we said at the outset, the Gemara doesn't really give us any clue as to why Rav Huna would say that Nedarim shiny. And of course, we start with the Rivash, and that seems to be the simplest way to go. That the Rivash says we're not operating with umdana, and therefore you cannot derive any conclusions based on Nedarim, because in Nedarim leave umdana out of the picture, but rather we derive it from ha'adam b'shvua. But the Ritva, again, in the second line before the end of the right column says time of the Kra, and therefore time of the Kra gives me exactly what I need, namely the umdur demuchach of adaiti the hachilo nodar, and then we're really stuck, because now on the one hand we've defended Rabbah based on time of the Kra, and umdur demucha becomes a universal halacha that's not limited to Nedarim. Hence, we justify Rabbah's analogy to matvis in dini momenos, but again, we're going to be stuck with trying to understand Rav Huna. Why the distinction once we're granted that there's a halacha of umder demuchach, which is the time of the Kra. Adaiti dehachi lo nada. So in the paragraph on the left column called Vatam, the Birkas Shmuel, as you know, a primary Talmud of Reb Chaim, is going to try to use a lumvis to answer basically two questions. I think there's like killing two birds with one stone, because on the one hand, even in the context of Rabbah, the Ritva is saying that we need the pasuk of Ha'adam b'Shvuah. We're going to go into time of the Kra, and then we're going to derive a universal halacha of adaiti dehachi lo nadar under the demucha. But yet, why do we need the pasuk? So we're going to have to come up with a havamina before the pasuk, which would negate the svara of adaiti dehachi lo nadar. That's point number one that the Birkas Shmuel is going to address. Point number two, finally, at the end of the day, we're going to have to assume that if you have a special svara which necessitates the drasha of and justifies the drasha of Ha'adam b'Shvuah, meaning that there was reason to think and to believe that in Neder, despite the ones, the Neder would be Chal, then we have to talk about Rav Huna. Why after the limud of umdana demuchach do we not equate hatfasas zchuyosov with Nidrei Onsin? The Birkas Shmuel says the following: we have an institution called Hatoras Nedarim. And under what circumstances does the Torah require that the Chacham be matir the neder? That's called Pesach. What is Pesach? Pesach means that if you would have known X, would you have taken the neder? As opposed to Charata, where a new situation arises. And obviously in Pesach, the Noder says, had I known X, I would never have taken the neder. So the question is, why do we need Hatoras Chacham? Why not just apply the principle of Adaiti dehachi lo nada? So therefore, we're going to have to come to conclusion that there's no way of being mavatal and neder based on our analysis of his das. We must come on to the chacham to be matir the neder. Ubedin zeh, at the end of the paragraph atam, hifkia hatoras hanidor midin tos. So therefore, we need Ha'adam b'Shvuah, because if you're operating midin tos, you're always going to ask yourself the question, why do I have to come on to Hatoras Nedarim in the case of a Pesach? Now the Birkas Shmuel goes a step further, and he says the following. And this is very fundamental and very much reminds me of something we discussed, I think it was either a week or two ago, in the name of the Granat of Naftali Trub. And to differentiate between Nedarim and every other chalos. The chalos Nedarim is unique. Why? After all, you're creating an Isur Neder where the Torah never recognized this Isur. It's Barami Libo. You're creating a new Isur. So do you have the das to create that Isur? The Torah is going to create the Isur. What do you have to step up and do? Just take the Neder. Everything lies in the language. Now we go back to your description of contractual agreements. Right now in Nedarim, we're going to go back to the actual contract. What's the contract? The haflas peh, the lashon haneder. He says the following on the third line: Ein adam poel es chalos isur neder. How could you create an isur neder on something that's mutter? It can only be that the Torah creates the chalos neder. So what is the pasha nedarim? What do? You don't create the chalos, so what do you do? Ela biyofet shal adam omer lashon shal kabal atzmo. I emphasize the word lashon. And therefore, the Torah says, as a result of your lashon, you have to live up to your lashon. Lo yachal dvara, don't desecrate your lashon. V'kevan shehanoder lo poel b'daito ubertzono es ha'isur. Memela ain't tzarch shielo rotzon al isur. We're not going to say adaiti the hachi. We have an under the muchach that you didn't want the neder. We're going to look at the neder itself. And why are we going to be totally focused on the neder from A to Z? Because the Torah says that we're going to create the chalos. You're going to just create the neder. We'll do the rest. You don't have to do the... When there's halach of das, that means the chalos is a result of the das, then we have to analyze your das. And adaiti the hachi lo nada. But in the case of the Nedarim, we're not operating within das. Because das means I have the bilus over creating the chalos. But in Nedarim, I don't have the bilus to create a chalos isur on something that Torah says is mutter. The Torah is going to create that chalos. What you're going to do is, you're going to set the process in motion by taking a neder. We're going to look at your neder, and the lashon neder will determine the neder. El shebikol makom yeshno chisaron acher. Okay, now what we're going to have to do is, according to Birkas Shmuel, we're going to have to say that even the lashon neder is not a lashon neder. How so? We have a principle called piva libo shavin, and the answer is, if he doesn't want to asa b'neder, he calls it muta beikar neder. Ein ka ma'isa neder klal. Do you see where the Birkas Shmuel is up against the wall? He has no choice but to say that in those cases where we apply the principle of piva libo shavin, and therefore we undermine the validity of the neder, the only way you could say it is ein kan ma'isa neder klal, which means that basically we're going to put a t'nai in his lashon neder. Narkivet hatnai betoch lashon neder, as if he said that I want this ned to be chal if so and so decides not to come, willingly decides, makes that deliberate decision, and that's what we're going to derive from what pasuk? From Adam b'shvua. That Adam b'shvua is going to allow me to take an imagined a fantasy t'nai and create a t'nai in his lashon haneder. Meaning, the Birkas Shmuel is not willing to say that all my lamdas and my distinctions, setting up Nedarim as a separate Allah, because he's not creating the chalos, but rather everything licked in the lashon. He's not willing to say that lamaskana after Adam b'shvua, we're going to drop the ball on that. So he's in a bind. On the one hand, he has to accept that lamdas, and that's going to be critical to explain the sheet of Rav Huna. Do you begin to see where Rav Huna is going to be beautiful according to the Birkas Shmuel? Don't prove anything from the Nedarim, because the neder is not chal. That's already a din in the Nedarim. But at the same time, he has to justify why is it that the neder is not chal. After all, if you take the lashon on neder, he said im lo tavo, and he didn't come. So the neder should be chal. Why does the Mishnah establish Nidrei Onsin doesn't even need hataras chacham? So the Birkas Shmuel has no choice but to say ein kan ma'isa neder klal. That somehow, magically, through the mechanism of Adam b'shvua, we're going to create a t'nai in his lashon neder, as if he made that t'nai.
But to say the same thing for talos also, meaning that the talos is not on his das; it's within the language of the lashon.
Right, you're going to have to somehow fit it into the lashon neder, which is a very difficult jump. Now, at this point, we have. Yeah.
In the either in the Birkas Shmuel or just in general, could you be machalik between Nedarim and Shvuos based on the Chefza Gava chiluk we spoke about in the beginning, that if you're making a Chefza, you're designated Kilu Hekdesh, then maybe the Birkas Shmuel's svara makes sense. You've really designated this thing, you have a certain status, whereas it's on the Gavra, then you may have a little bit more flexibility in terms of taking the das into account, the same way you would if the person accepts upon himself to do any other sort of
okay, let me think about that. It sounds like a valid svara that you're saying. I don't know. All right, we only have 10 minutes left, and I'm always pressured for time. So let me just try to see if we can put things together over here. Now, Rabbah asks a kash on Rav Huna from our Mishnah. And the Ran says the following. Again, according to Rav Huna, how does he defend himself against the raya from our Mishnah? What breaks up the analogy to our Mishnah? Says the Ran, in the case of Dine Momenos, of Hatfosas Zuchuyosa, which is called Mechila, he's got to be explicit in the Tanai. Everything depends on his Tanai. However, in the case of Nedarim, there, we're going to look at his Das. So let's come back to the Ran in just a minute. The Rosh takes a different approach in explaining Rav Huna, and he says the following, that in Neder, there's a halacha called Piv V'libo Shavin. And we have a right to conclude that if he would have known this, he wouldn't have taken the Neder. But b'mamon, lo azlinin bosa machshavas libo. In Mamonos, everything depends upon the Tanai. This is the way the Rosh understands Rav Huna, justifying the distinction between the two. So let's go over this again. The Ran, on the one hand, is going to explain Rav Huna within the context of Hayalola Hasnos Velo Hisna. In other words, we're going to ask ourselves the following question. Did you, when you were matfis yours, did you anticipate the possibility or the likelihood of some sort of an ones? And if the answer to that is yes, then why didn't you stipulate that? Says the Keren Orah that according to the Ran, in explaining Rav Huna, what would be in a case of an ones de lo shchiach? He says the following. Nafkamida bein bir haran b'das Rav Huna, bein bir rosh b'das Rav Huna, shalatam haran Rav Huna savar she'ein ones. Why is there no ones in the case of matvis chuyosav? She mishum shehayalo lahasnos, meaning he should have realized that it's quite possible that the bridge would break down. Imkain, says the Keren Orah, based on this Ran, but ones she'eno shliach klal, if you can't fault him, well, why didn't you stipulate this? Because it wasn't, it was a tsunami that comes once every 2,000 years. Gam Rav Huna modeh sheyesh ones. And you can't fault him by not spelling it out. Omnam, however, l'divrei harosh, shetaimush Rav Huna, shebimomenos ein holchim achar daito, el achar dvarav, according to the Rosh, everything depends upon what's written in the shtar or what he formulated verbally in his agreement. Then imkain gamba ones she'eno shchiach, even if we don't blame him, well, you're blameless because this was not something that you anticipated. We can't say to you, well, you should have made it tonight. That nevertheless, it's not considered an onus. We don't take onus into account. Why? Because in Momenos, ein holchim achar daito.
Well, if the Ran was correct, then why didn't the Gemara just say when it's an onus to shliach?
Well, no, according to the Ran, that's exactly what the Gemara says in Rabbah. We're going to extrapolate from what the Gemara says in Rabbah to explain Rav Huna. Just that Rabbah is only willing to say it in a case, for example, of an onus that's mamish shchiach, and Rav is willing to say that, look, if it's eno shchiach klal, that's one thing, but if it still fits into that range of shchiach v'lo shchiach, then eno chinami, the onus will be chal. And here I think we want to add a point here of Rav Naftali Trupp on page Memtes. Do you see where if you drop down on the right column, it says b'chidusha granat, kosav bir nosaf b'divrei harosh. In other words, that which we saw in the Rosh, that we don't care in Dini Momenos what your das was, and we're not going to say, well, you didn't think of this, you're not guilty. We're not going to blame you for not making the Tanai explicit and making exceptions to the Tanai. Says Rab Naftali, now I understand the difference between Nedarim and Dini Momenos. Sheva Dini Momenos ha'esek nasa ben shnei tzaddim. There are two people that are in an agreement, and therefore the kinyan is chal unless you indicate that al das kain, you don't want the kinyan. But if you don't make that stipulation, then this is a cooperative agreement. Mashen came in Nedarim shenasim beino levein atzmo. Then we're not going to say to him, well, you should have specified that if this happens and it's an onus, you don't want the ned to be chal. It's all bein adam liatzmo. Now, going back to page Memches for the last few minutes that we have, he says at the end of the left column, ubidome l'divrei arishonim anal. Right, we had already an explanation of Rabbah back here on Daf Mem Vav, on page Mem Vav.
I'm sorry, where is the Ubidome?
Yeah, Ubidome. That's the last, almost the last paragraph on the left column Memches. B'das Rav Huna lechalik bein nedarim lemomenos metzina beritva. Hasover shegam b'das Rabba shedima sadina mikom kom yesh chiluk beineim umechadish haritva sha'achar sheneschadish b'posuk lahatir es haneder midin adam b'shvua yesh b'zeh lahatir yoser midin umdina b'shar kinyon. According to the Ritva, once we're darshaning time of the Kra in the framework of Rabba's Shita, then we can almost make a kal v'chomer that if in Nedarim we have the pasuk that teaches us that we look at his das, and how much more so in Kinyonim. For who? Shebeshar Kinyonim be ones shchiach tuva ein tanis ones mishum di boile lasnuye velo asne iu di afseda nafshe omnam bedine Nedarim Nidrei Onsin kosav aritva shafilu be ones koldahu misbatel aneder. So we now understand, says the Ritva, the shita of Rav Huna. In the case of Nedarim, where everything depends upon piv v'libo shavim, then we derive from our other b'shvua that if adaiti da'achilo nadar, then it makes sense that the neder will not be chal. But in Dine Momenos, which is Torah's Kinyonim, and now you want to say, well, you know what? His obligation is not binding because he was onus, and you're going to base yourself on umdana, you're going to have a very, very strong, absolutely convincing umdana in order to break up a kinyan. And that's why I thought we could combine this with what we saw in Reb Naftali Trump. So again, just to see a summary of the Birkas Shmuel here on page Memtes, the first paragraph on the right side, Avol b'nedarim ein das po elas esachalos, ela shiv yesh taina ta'us. If yesh tainas ones, hu chisaram bi'etzem maisa haneder, shasiyas haneder, when is it considered a maisa neder? Only if it's pivalibo shavin. Imkain, kol shaya eza ones, any ones whatsoever. That's what the Ritva called an ones koldahu. If shalom shahaya belibo gama al ones zeh. We're not going to say that he had in mind in his lave that even in such a case of onus he wants the neder, and therefore there's no ma'aser neder at all. And therefore Rav Huna makes the statement that you cannot prove anything from nedarim to what? To dini momenos. Why? Because in dini momenos we have a principle that dvarim shebelev lo havi dvarim. And unless we have an absolute umdana of toes, then we're not going to be mevatel the kinyan. And that's what he says in the name of Reb Chaim in the next paragraph. Well, this will conclude for today. That bekinyanim ha'ones bo levatel as das hakinyan. So what are you doing now? You had already das kinyan. Now you're saying onus. The onus is going to be mevatel the das hakinyan. Lazet tzarich umdana brura. We need an absolute umdana to be mevatel is das. Kidei shelo yeh dvarim shebelev. Because otherwise you want to be mevatel is das based on what he thought. Well, do you have an absolutely convincing, ironclad, 100% umdana? Lekach be onus koldahu, ein tainis onus. If it's a regular ones, that's not considered a valid taina. We don't have an umdana that's brura. But b'nedarim, where we need the das for the maisa neder, not for the chalos ha-neder, then ain't tzarich umdana brura lezeh. Kevan shein boim levatel ha-chalos. In other words, when the das creates the chalos, that's in kinyanim, you now you want to be mevatel the kinyan by being mevatel is das. For that you need what? A clear cut 100% umdana. But in the case of Nedarim, all we have to do is decide whether he had das for his maisa neder. That's all we need. And therefore, even in a case of ones kaldahu, we could say that he didn't have that das for the maisa chalos. In other words, Reb Chaim seems to be assuming that there are two stages over here. When you have a das that creates a chalos, now you need a tremendous power to undermine and invalidate that das. But if I don't need the das to create the chalos, like in the case of Nedarim, all I need is to set up a maisa. Okay, I'm not fighting against the chalos over here. I'm not fighting against das. All I need is that he had in mind this neder, and he wants the neder. And if he didn't have in mind this neder, then it's not pivalibo shavim. He doesn't have the lave, and therefore his peh, his aflas peh, is not considered a maisa neder. If I could push it for one more minute, umosif hagrach shemachmas tam ze vaday shehanoder neman al atzmo. Again, this is very similar to what we saw in Rab Naftali, that when the noder comes forward and he says, I didn't have in mind that this neder should be chal if, etc., then we believe him. But when it comes to a deal and an agreement between two parties, and he wants to say, well, I didn't have in mind this and that. It wasn't pivali boshavin. What do you mean? You had an agreement for a contract. You had das to create the chalos. Now you want to claim, well, I didn't have das. So for that, you need an absolute 100% foolproof umdana demucha. So on both sides, this is about half of what I wanted to cover today. The other half was about V'lanar lo sasa davar, which is number hey. But I don't know. We'll see. I want to talk about Me'ila B'Konomos next week, because that's a fundamental sugya. So we'll see. So I take this opportunity to thank everyone for coming and have a great week. Okay then? It's good. You too. Of course, we have this problem here with the chashmal, but we'll see.
Welcome.